My name is Doug Ulwick. I'm the president of the Historical Society of Old Abington, and we thank you for finding us here in a different venue for us. We are normally in our home at the Dyer Memorial Library on Center Avenue, but we have had a couple of recent shows that have kind of filled the place. And when I was looking at this one, I thought, no, I think we're going to outgrow that space pretty quickly. So the Senior Center very generously offered their facilities for us here today. And I love the fact it's handicapped accessible. I love the fact it handles a much bigger crowd, and hope you're all comfortable in your seats. I kind of miss the ambiance of being in an antique building full of antiques, full of history. But that's okay. We'll do fine. So again, thank you all for being here. We're going to start today's program the way we start all of our programs, with a salute to the flag. So if you will join me, please stand if you're able or desire to. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. You may take your seats. The Historical Society of Old Abington is a group of volunteers who recognize the history of the old town of Abington, which is present-day Abington, Rockland, Whitman, and even a little bit of Hanover, actually. We were established back in the 1930s, and we hold 6, they used to be called programs, a year. We do, at this point, a spring semester of October, November, December, the first Sunday afternoon at 2:30. And then we take a break for the winter months when no one wants to travel and we don't want to have to cancel. And we resume in March, April, and May. So this is the last program of our 2018-2019 series. And we welcome you all for this. And again, as always, it's free and open to the public. And happy to see you here and happy to share history. Today's topic came about in an interesting way to us. I had an email addressed to me, and most of them that come to the Historical Society are addressed to me, asking what we knew about this Lampson guy who made a motorcycle in Abington. And of course I looked at it and I said, who? Motorcycle? Abington? We knew about the Buffum automobile that was made in Abington and have done programs about it, and we're pretty familiar with it. But we had no idea that there was a motorcycle made in Abington until this gentleman from Canada hit me up and said, what do you know? Well, we didn't know, but we learned, and we learned a lot. And Rick and I have been corresponding back to learn more and to share information. We meet as a committee, as a group, as a society after our last program of the year to plan next year. So a little less than a year ago, we began to look at these programs, and I thought, wouldn't it be nice if the Lampson could come home, could come back to Abington, and we could see this motorcycle and hear about this motorcycle in the town in which it was built. And on a whim, I sent an email to Canada and said, Rick Wolf, what will it take to get you to bring the Lampson back to Abington? I mean, we could fundraise, we can get sponsors, we can do whatever, but I'd really like to make this happen. And the email that came back to me, actually he picked up the phone and said, I'll just bring it. Okay. So that conversation is what led up to today. And he just brought it. Anyway, and I've been delighted to have Rick and his wife, Marianne, raise your hand. She has to put up with him and his habits and his hobbies. Anyway, they made the 11-hour drive from Ottawa yesterday and joined me at my home. Was it 11?
London.
London, I'm sorry, London. I always get my Canadian locations mixed up. But they made the trek yesterday and joined me at my Dale Street home overnight, so they didn't have to make the trek today. And we've had a delightful time visiting and learning and chatting about what we knew, and I think learning a lot more. Something else happened today, and that is, I kind of had an inkling it might happen today, but several of the descendants of Ernest Lamson, who built this motorcycle, motorbike, whatever we're going to call it today, showed up. And they're here. Could I ask the descendants to please stand so everyone can see who you are? thank you all for being here. We have several generations here recognized, and we'll have perhaps a chance to chat with them later after they see what their grandfather, great-grandfather, great-great-grandfather produced, and talk more about that. So anyway, it's my pleasure to introduce Rick Wolf to us. And Rick, I think I want to start talking a little bit about your background. Now, you have an arts training, and you also worked for Ford.
Worked for Ford Motor Company for 30 years.
Okay, and what did you do for Ford Motor Company? You didn't restore motorcycles?
No. For part
Loud
of my,
so they can hear you.
Part of my work there, I worked for their paint department and actually detailed state of Mass police units. And
shame on you.
It's a living. I got to fund these somehow. But I went on to be a muralist for them for about 11 years, painting murals on walls and doing artwork for their offices. And gradually led me to the end, to my retirement, where I was able to put more time into what my passion is, and that's conserving and preserving American history.
Now, you have quite a collection.
Yes, I do.
This is a piece.
That's right.
Can you give the audience some sense of the range of what you have collected?
From the state of Mass, I have a considerable collection of bicycles and motorcycles. I actually have a 1907 Marsh Metz, which was only made in Brockton, just a few minutes from here. And that was from the amalgamation of Charles H. Metz from Waltham and Alonzo and William Marsh from Brockton.
Brockton, absolutely. Excellent. So, and then you came across in pieces, there's a story here, you came across separately an engine.
Yes, I did.
And a frame.
Yes, I did.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about that tale, because it's fascinating how the serendipity of all this came together that you would end up pursuing this.
In around 1997, I was having dinner with a friend in the Finger Lakes, New York, Jim Denny. And Jim is also an affluent motorcycle collector and historian kind of fella. And he had this motor sitting on his shelf for the longest time. And he knew I wanted to acquire it. And after the dinner that night, he says, Rick, I gave it great thought, and I have too many projects on the board, and I think you can do something with this. So I acquired it from Jim with some trade of photographs and a little bit of money, and still I had no information on it. No detailed information at all what this engine was about. There's nothing in literature or books or any underlying history books out there. So it sat on my shelf. And then I acquired a frame from a fellow in Ontario. He had some bicycle frames, and this particular frame was laying in the batch of frames that I bought, but I did not know it belonged to the Lampson. And again, another thing went on the shelf for future endeavors.
You must have big shelves.
Big shelves. And eventually doing a motorcycle show in Rhinebeck, New York, one of my good close friends from New Jersey acquired the image of the sales piece in the frame there of the Lampson. And from that imagery, I was able to connect things that I had laying around in my collection. The frame mated up with the motor. Because of the motor mounts are completely indigenous to this machine. Nowhere else will you find motor mounts on any other motorized bike from that time frame like it. Ernest's project was completely identifiable on its own. And
so this was the Cinderella glass slipper.
It was.
It fit this engine fit this frame perfectly.
Kind of opened up a whole ball of wax.
It would have. Now, I want to backtrack a little about the motor. When he found it, Jim, I'm sorry, found it?
Yep.
He didn't find it on a motorcycle. He didn't find it. He found it on a boat?
It was in Finger Lakes, New York, in Skaneateles.
Skaneateles. I went to school in New York. The only reason I know how to pronounce that.
Okay. And it was found by a picker in a boathouse, and it was connected to a child's little boat so they could ride around in a pond in it. It had a jack shaft connected to the main shaft with a brass prop. The boat had melted into the landscape, but the motor was up off the ground, which conserved it. And the fellow that found it sold it to my friend Jim, and then to me.
We're going to talk in a few minutes about how this thing operates, but what surprises me about that story is this is a fairly complicated kit of parts to run. Putting it on a boat didn't make it any easier, did it?
No, it didn't.
So
for a young person,
that would have been very challenging.
Yeah, even if he was 12 years old, it had to, his father would have likely had to start it for him.
Right. Right, absolutely. Okay, but as I said, we'll talk about how that comes together. And so you had an engine that happened to fit a frame that was mostly together, though it was damaged, that you happened to have, and that was the spark to say, let's make this thing happen.
Put some energy into it.
Right, absolutely. And some of the energy you put into it was finishing it out. I mean, it didn't have a fuel tank, it didn't have an oil tank, it didn't have a battery box. Now, you used the photograph in the advertisement or the drawing in the advertisement as your model, is that correct?
Correct. We scaled, I had a friend of mine, Jim Carson. Jim was a top restorer for R&M Auctions. I'm not sure if you folks have heard of that place, but it's one of the biggest auction houses in North America, and they work on high-end automobiles like Duesenbergs and Packards and motorcycles also. And Jim got burnt out from working for them, and I kind of hired him on working with me, so he helps me in a lot in my endeavors. This was a two-man project. To pull it off myself, I could have done it, but not in the time frame I was looking at. So Jimmy and I dove in.
Now, how much guessing is involved in all this? The photograph is quite good. I mean, it really showed a lot of detail.
The photograph was quite good, but Jim had access to some updated research equipment from R&M that we could enhance that imagery there and find some fine detailings like the script on the tank.
Okay.
And Jim, that's all hand inlaid. That's all hand inlaid paintwork on the tank, which would have been done in the day. And the striping on the frame is all hand done.
Okay, excellent. And now the tires and wheels, the wheels are wood, by the way, which is kind of interesting.
Made of ash.
Okay.
And they're period. They're from 1898 till about 1910 period. They're a G&J rim, which were made in Chicago, which he would have bought to use. The tires are obviously not from that period, but it's what we get today. And they're actually Dutch made.
And also, I think you shared with me that, well, a couple of things. The frame was made elsewhere.
The frame, Ernest would have got his frames from a mass producer like most people did. This frame came out of Chicago from the Faber Cycle Company, and it's marked right on the crank arms. It says 1901 Faber, and in his sales brochure, it talks intensely about using the Faber frames and pedal cranks in his cycles. And that kind of ironcladded it to being the proper frame for the whole machine.
Now, they would have made frames for other manufacturers who were involved in similar things, or just bicycles?
All. They were businessmen, so they would be building things for anybody that asked for them.
Okay. Yet, and again, from previous talking, this is a fairly delicate frame to deal with local road conditions of the time. We're assuming there wasn't a lot of paving. And
well, the road conditions were very advantageous. They were purely horse trails. So you'd have ruts and ditches and stones in the middle of your path. So these bikes are pretty nimble. They wouldn't sometimes hold up to the road conditions, and that's where failure comes in.
Okay. And obviously, why no one rides a motorcycle that looks like this anymore. They got heavier frames and different tires and everything to adapt to the climate, the usage rather, the local usage at the time. Could you kind of run us through, this is complicated. You don't jump on this thing and turn a key and go away. I mean,
you just don't jump on it right away.
Okay.
I can stop.
Yeah, if you'd kind of take us through, how would you start this? You shared with me earlier that there is no neutral, there is no idle. Once you get it going, you're going.
It's all direct drive, so there's no clutch. Clutches didn't really come into play. Well, E.R. Thomas from Buffalo, New York, kind of devised a hand-operated clutch. It was just a little lever that was down the frame that raised and lowered this pulley. but this is pretty primitive. When Ernest developed this, he was looking at making it economical. So this was the economical machine that he made, which was the Model A. He also made a Model B, which was a little more advanced in size. It was a 2 horsepower, a longer wheelbase, and would carry a heavier rider. But with this bike here, it's a 1.5 horsepower. He would have sold this for $150 to the buyer. And
in 1901.
In 1901, which was still a considerable amount of money. You could buy a piece of property for that. It runs on a round belt. It has good compression, as you can hear.
I can hear that from here, yes.
But to start this machine, it's labor intensive. You just don't jump on these and ride off. There should be a toolkit that I haven't fashioned on here yet, which would have had your repair tools as a wrench. There'd be a small air pump, but the main tool would have been a syringe. They're non-existent. And the syringe was a metal siphoning tool. The fellow would go over to the gas tank, dip the syringe into the tank, siphon out a little bit of gas. This is your priming cup. He'd open the priming cup up, drop the fuel through this hole here, and it would go into the combustion chamber. So that job's done. And then the next job is adjusting the oil drip for how fast you think you're going to be going so that you would have at least 3 drips per minute. So you would see the drips coming down here once the engine's running and adjust your drips accordingly.
So that's something like we might call a sight glass in order
it's a sight glass.
To see the actual drip coming through.
Yes.
And you would then time it to understand.
You would time it. He had a pocket watch right here
Okay.
that he could time the drips with.
And this is something you do before you start?
Before you start.
Okay.
You want to get everything all adjusted, and then you would adjust your advance and retard, so you want to put it in advance. And then the next fun job. This carburetor that's on here is not a float
We
carburetor.
should turn it around, can we?
Sure.
Okay. Need help?
No, I can't.
You got it, okay. If you're going to be talking about this side, let's talk about this side. Thank you for
Here we
indulging me.
Now this carburetor here is a Pacomi carburetor. They were made in the U.S. here near Chicago, Indiana, I believe. And what it is, it's not a float actuated carburetor, but a mixing carb with layers of pancakes inside with screens. And what happens is it has an atmospheric valve in here. So every time the engine turns over, it creates a suction noise. You hear that little suction noise? Well, that suction noise is sucking air through here. It opens that valve up, so the fuel sucks through the gas line here, goes through the little venturi here, past the valve, and then gets sucked into those pancakes. Now imagine this is one of the fibers of the pancake, and this is a fuel molecule. So that fuel molecule is hitting that fiber and splitting. Then it gets to the next pancake. This guy will divide into 2, and this one will divide, and then the next one will divide into 4, and it becomes a vapor, a gas vapor, which helps along with the combustion of the engine.
But the point is, you don't put raw gas into the cylinder engine. You put a mixture of air and gas into
With the
a mist.
carburetor, yes.
And that's what the carburetor does,
That's
is
right.
it mixes the air and the gasoline into a mist that is then sprayed into the engine to
Exactly.
ignite and expand.
And then from there, the rider will mount the machine. This is your ignition switch. This is your battery box. You'll see little images here, circles with diagrams of like shooting things there. Well, that's to show that that's electricity. That's the symbol for electricity back then. So it acknowledges that's where the battery power is. So once he has the switch in the off position, he will mount. There wouldn't be this rear stand on here. He'd start to pedal. Once he gets himself up to a little bit of speed to build the momentum up, he will drop this switch and it'll go bang. Then he'll adjust his timing to the proper setting, adjust his air again, because in a climate like today where it's moist and damp out, he may want to add a little more air, or he may want to lean it up with a little more fuel to get him going. Once he gets going down the road, he'll get up to about 35 miles an hour, which is pretty good for 1901.
I think it's amazing. But the point of adjusting, retarding or adjusting the spark and the air, That's in place of a throttle?
Exactly.
That's how fast you go?
By advancing and retarding your timing, you increase or decrease your speed.
Okay.
Because the carburetor has no real throttle. It's
then,
purely
I was
a
going to say,
mixer.
there's no accelerator on this, there's no neutral on this, there's no reverse on this.
No.
You have one option.
One way
go
only.
forward.
That's right.
And as soon as you've thrown that electrical switch and got scared out of your pants because it just went boom,
So
then you're going.
And if you had to make an emergency stop,
You
say there's a
didn't.
cow on the road,
You didn't.
you hit the kill button, you pedal backwards like your regular bicycle. It has a coaster brake in the rear.
And if
You're going 35 miles an hour,
good luck.
From here to the doors, you might stop.
That you have to anticipate the cow.
Yeah, to
By quite a
anticipate
bit.
anything, even a stone in the ground.
Amazing. And I'm sorry, the range, you said 35 miles an hour?
On this fuel tank capacity here, you get about 75 miles to that tank.
That's pretty good. Yeah. If you didn't have a flat tire.
If you didn't have flat.
Okay.
Or hit a cow.
Or hit a cow. There we go. Okay. Or get thrown off. And you
And a
shared,
lot of riders, that was the biggest complaint, being thrown from their bike.
and they didn't wear helmets, so
No.
good luck. And you shared something with me earlier about this form of carburetor. The other thing that could happen easily is it could catch on fire next to the fuel tank, which could explode.
So imagine a hot engine, and the bike stalled, and you went to fire it up again, and it persisted. Well, every time you turn that engine over, he lifts. What's sitting on top of that valve is unspent fuel. The unspent fuel will drip down
onto the hot engine next to the points that are electrified.
Electrical,
yeah.
So you have ignition to the fumes from the gas, and you now have a fire.
Next to a fuel tank.
That's why I have not. I've got so many bikes that run. This one will not run.
By choice.
Because it's number one. It's the only one known, and we can't lose this piece of history. It's nice to look at, and that's what it's meant for.
Absolutely. And you also shared with me, because this is the first time I've seen that particular light on the front of this bike. That's I'm sorry, was it an acetylene gas?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
There's two canisters in this lamp, and one canister is water, one side's carbide. Now, when you mix calcium carbide with water, you produce acetylene gas. Just like guys weld in a car shop, brazing with, it's the same process. Very volatile. If you don't clean the orifice on the burner in these lamps and try to ignite, you can blow your arm off. There's enough capacity in this amount of carbide here to take out 5 people.
Do you get the sense this was kind of a hazardous activity? I'm not sure I'd really want to just hop right on.
Nobody's going to steal it.
No. Well, they can't. There's no gas in it.
That's right.
Or oil.
Or it's already on fire.
Or acetylene. So we're already there. We're good. Anyway, absolutely amazing. And the technology of the time evolved from there. We also chatted, we still try to figure out some mysteries with this. In order to create an engine like this, it has to be sand cast, is that right? And the facility to do that is substantial. And there's no evidence that he went out and ordered an engine. So he likely had something local. Well, about maybe not even a quarter-mile away down the road, down the same road, was the Buffum Automobile Company. And we know a lot about Mr. Buffum, and he had one of the first production 4-cylinder cars in the world. And his #1 and only is now in an automobile museum in The Hague. It used to be in Owl's Head in Maine and got auctioned off and now resides in The Hague. But he made 4-cylinder engines, he made 2-cylinder engines, he made 8-cylinder engines, and I believe he made a 12-cylinder engine. He clearly had casting capacity in order to do that. So there's a possibility, since they were both working at the same time, that Mr. Lamson ended up communicating with his literally neighbor, Mr. Buffum, and that they might have collaborated to come up with this engine, because other than that, we don't quite know how it came into being. magazine. But where the two were in such close proximity at the same time doing similar things, there's a good chance that they knew each other and worked together in order to make this happen. Now, as much as this is the one and only, a little later, another Lampson engine surfaced, and I think it surfaced in Las Vegas.
Yes,
is that correct? But it's a quite different assembly. Can you tell us maybe a little more about that?
Well, as in the article to the Antique Motorcycle Club magazine, it came about...
Antique Motorcycle Magazine. It's the cover story.
And a collection of motorcycles came up for auction in Vegas. And the writer of that article spotted it, and that's why it was added to the article. And he says, "Rick, I found another Lamson." I said, "No way."
How dare you?
I thought it came about because of the article, but it came about because now the article's out, more people like yourselves are hearing about it, so more information's going to float to the top, we hope. And the only downside to it was it wasn't an original Lamson. It was only the bottom engine cases. And the fellow that contrived it put the engine onto a bicycle and made up some funky things on it. He took an old compressor cylinder and put it on the engine, because all he had was the base of the engine. But the cool thing about it all is the engine number. It was engine number 93. So that information is undeniably awesome, because that tells us Ernest at least had 93 bikes out there at one time. And you got to remember, he was short-lived. Between 1901 and by the time that advertisement came out in 02, Ernest was out of business. He was short-lived.
At least in doing motorcycles.
And doing motorcycles. He continued on with his
machine shop,
working on motorcycles, automobiles, and bicycles.
Ernest was a busy man. We've done a little bit of research about him. And he came to Abington. He was originally born in Weymouth, and came to Abington and ended up marrying a daughter of the Reed family. They were a very wealthy family in town. They had, most of the sons fought in the Civil War, and they actually had a lot of property around the Abington train station. And the old Abington train station was on the corner of Park Ave, across the street from the new one. They had a mansion house there. In fact, off of Park Ave is Reed Street. That was George Reed's family. So anyway, Ernest ended up marrying their daughter, and they had 3 children. They had a daughter, a son, and a daughter. And not long after the youngest of the 3 was born, his wife died and left him alone. Pretty soon after, the Reeds gave him the house he was apparently living in with the children. Very generous gesture. They, ceded it over to him for $1. In pretty short order, his mother moved in with him, probably to help with the kids, we're guessing. He remarried within a year, Mabel Luby from Rockland, and his mother gave him a $2,500 mortgage. That was a lot of money in that time, and we're not quite sure whether he might have built his machine shop from that. We're not quite sure what it went, but suddenly there was an infusion of cash roughly about 10 years before the first motorcycle was produced, but it seemed to give him some liquidity. At some point, we don't know exactly when, he apparently divorced Mabel and ended up remarrying, and the descendants of his 3rd wife are here. So it's kind of exciting to see that happened. And he had 1 daughter, I believe that's correct, by his 3rd wife. And she went on and she married and became a Watson, if I have that correct. Is that sounding familiar to the family genealogy?
Ernest's daughter married my father, Vernon Watson.
Okay, so that's how Ms. Lamson became Mrs. Watson and created the family that's here with us today. Anyway, he died fairly young. He died he was born in 1860, I believe it was, and died, I believe, we haven't had a date of death for him or a death certificate or anything else, but we did find in 1923 that his children from his first marriage gave up legally by deed any property right over Corinne, his third wife's house and property. They said, it's yours free and clear. So we know he was dead by then. So we know he was gone by 23. We've guessed he died in 22. But, you know, the family being here today is wonderful because we're going to learn a lot more from what they can tell us about the man who created this machine and how he lived the rest of his life. We know he was the son of a Civil War veteran, I think I had that right, who died in the Civil War and was certainly, you know, brought up by the rest of the town of Weymouth, basically, until he came to Abington and became a machinist here. We've heard evidence along the way by another writer who I don't have access to, who said he did some studying in New York. I have no way of verifying that, so we're still learning. And it's one of the great things about doing a program like we're doing today. We share what we know. We admit what we don't know. And a lot of times people come forward to help us fill in the blanks. So just because we're doing a program today doesn't mean that the learning stops about anything that we're doing. It keeps going, and we keep gathering information. I know Rick will be leaving here today with a ton of stuff he didn't know before he arrived at Abington. So it's certainly useful to him in his research and where we go from here and where he goes from here. So this has opened the door to other things. And we would like to learn to see if there's any way of documenting if there was any relationship business-wise between Lamson and Buffum, because they were both manufacturing engines on the same block, on the same street, in the same town at the same time. So one would think there was, but we don't know. But it's something we want to learn more about. So anyway, that is the bulk of what we wanted to talk about today. I'd like to, and we have quite a different crowd today, people we don't normally see, and that's good for us. Questions while we have everyone here? Yes?
Where's Bright Street?
Bright Street. I don't think it is. It might have been a paper street at the time. I've gone through everything I can find to find out about Bright Street. There was one in Brockton. I can't find that there was ever one in Abington.
I thought it was next to Bemis Drug.
That's Brighton Street, and it's in North Abington. So, and this was, I know what she's referring to. Very clearly in some of the advertising it listed Bright Street in Abington, and we're still scratching our heads over that one. I mean, it occurred to me it could have been the lane next to the shop. The shop, his shop was where Martini Flooring is right now. Just on Center Ave, right where the entrance to the train station is off of Center Ave. There was a house attached to it at one point, and we have photographs of that. And the house was moved by Littlefield Wyman, the nursery folks who eventually purchased the property. It was moved onto Park Avenue, right beyond where the old Abington train station was. In fact, Littlefield Wyman purchased the property from the railroad and moved the house there. It's owned, I believe, by Cindy Simmons and her family at this point. I went to high school with Cindy. So it's close by. But Bright Street may have been the lane beside that led to the pasture out back. It's as good a guess as any, but I've never found it on any maps of the time, on any, we have street listings from different times back then. They listed what streets existed in town and where they ran from and to and everything else, and it's not there. So again, the chance is that it might have been a paper street that was getting formalized that never got formalized. But it's a good question, and sorry, we don't know. Any other questions? Yes, Bill?
2 questions.
2? We only allow 1, okay.
I'm going to ask 2.
Okay.
What would these bikes have been used? Were they for pleasure in business? And what is the estimated replacement cost of this bike now as it stands?
Priceless. I'd say in a realistic marketplace today, 6 figures.
Yeah, don't touch it.
And it was used for pleasure, and you got to imagine, at $150 in 1901, it would have to be a person of stature or affluent standing in the township or surrounding areas to even afford it. So it was for pleasure and for the wealthy.
And I think you needed an engineering degree to operate it.
After a couple of lessons,
Okay.
they take it on.
Yes,
Did he ever take out a patent on his engines or on the motor?
I haven't seen one.
Did you folks say he had some patents?
For the hoop lock cutting device, not related
Okay.
to the,
He had patents for other devices that he
But
invented.
I'm sure if the research was done, they'd find the
and his
patents.
father, Daniel Lampson, had patented the hoop lock cutting device.
Okay, okay, so there were patents to the family, but not for the motorcycle engine, which is his original piece here, was the engine. I think most of what was fabricated else for it was not necessarily original, is that right?
It'd be from, he would have got the carburetor from another manufacturer. The handlebars would have came from somebody else. All the sonderies on the bicycle would have been made by other people.
Right, so it was assembled.
Just like a typical bicycle dealer, he would have got, like most bicycles were rebranded at the time with that guy's name. So John Hardware Store would have put his hardware name on the head badge and sold the bike, but he would have got the bike from the Mead Cycle Company in Chicago. And the same happened. Why go through the trial and tribulations of making a chassis when somebody's already tooled up for it? The cost of retooling your shop or fabricating is astronomical. So the crankset, the frame, the handlebars, the Sanger seat made by the Sanger Seat and Fork Company produced the seat, and the wheels are G&J, Gormley and Jeffries from Chicago. You know, so you or I, with a small amount of money, could actually fabricate. It's the engine.
Which he cast his name into and cast Abington. It's right cast into the engine Abington and Lampson. So I mean, the pride was there. And
That's the money
certainly-
shot.
Yeah, the money shot, well put. It is indeed that. And the other thing about where he was located, his house and everything else, those who are familiar with Abington history understand that what helped us take off as a shoemaking community was the railroad, because suddenly we could take in raw material and ship the shoes and boots that were made here anywhere in the world, because we had the railroad line running from here right into Boston. Well, his shop was right next to the Abington station. It was not necessarily a big deal to get these parts in and have them delivered literally next door and be able to get the stuff to assemble, and then to take his product as much as he was selling it and ship it out as well. It couldn't have been more convenient. He was literally next door. So it helped manufacturers do things like that. I don't know if it was as big a help to Buffum, who was doing automobiles. I don't think he was loading those onto train cars. Maybe, but those all seem to stay local. But it is interesting, particularly fascinating, that the parts you have here were all discovered in Canada, were they not?
Majority.
Absolutely. So, but the frame and the engine were.
The engine was New York, and the chassis was Canada. Wheels
Wherever.
from abroad. Yeah.
Wherever.
I've got like 200 wheels in my collection.
Shame on you. Anyway, so it's still, as anything I think at the time would have been. If they could have bought it, they bought it and assembled it accordingly.
But it's all about money. It's all
Absolutely.
who was financing them at the time. Even Indian Motorcycle in Springfield, one of the biggest motorcycle producers in America, they didn't use their own engine until 1908.
Mm-hmm.
They were using a Thor motor from Aurora, New York. Here's Lampson producing his own engine with his name on it.
Mm-hmm. Pretty remarkable.
I think that's awesome.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, yes?
Did you say that is number one of a,
It's the only Lampson motorcycle, complete Lampson known in the world.
like the other one is a number 93? Is yours
It's
a
just the engine. It's just this part, this right here.
Yeah.
Everything
Touch it.
else,
Don't touch it.
everything else is fake on that
On the other one.
on the other bike. The only thing he had there that was real Lampson was the engine cases.
And that's a 93 on it?
It had engine number 93. If you look at my engine number, which is on this little number plate down here, it's 2 number 1s, which is 11.
Is there a manufacturing date on it too?
1901. He was only in business for less than a year.
And apparently did almost 100 motors in that time. Whether they all ended up on bicycles or not, we're not even sure of that, are we?
Yeah, because he was saying he was also selling proprietary motors, which somebody could have used for cultivating or operating the washing machine.
So as much as this motor actually came off a boat, is there any chance that it was put on the boat in the
I
first
think
place?
with that, with the identification number that low, it presumably would have came off one of his prototypes.
That makes sense.
Because he would have likely had quite a few failures
Mhm.
with engine casting numbers
Until.
till the real one got off the line.
So 11 actually worked because it was on a boat, and we know that. So by 11, he got it figured out.
And what you'll find throughout collecting these kind of things, us collectors of motorcycles, we always find motors. It's hard to find the other components. Usually they cracked up. The riders smashed them, and the engines were recycled to another usable thing around a farm or a property to operate a water pump or whatever, and that's how come they exist today. And that's how we still find them. I've found so many engines operating water pumps on farms. And they'd say, oh yeah, Uncle Jed smashed it and this is what we use it for now. Which is good, because now it's up to somebody like me to bring it to this.
And part of the story you're telling is one that I came across also with the Buffum automobile. There's one, and the one was his prototype, and we often thought he kept it as proof he did patent his, or a lot of pieces of his, and we thought it was the proof of patent, that here it is, not only did I patent it, I made it, and here it is in use on this particular automobile. But the more research I did, the more I cut myself into the thinking of the time. At some point, it was just an old car. And what do? You got a new car. And you didn't care what happened to the old car. I mean, sometimes they got put out in the field to go run some equipment or something. But at some point, it stopped being used as a car because it was just an old car. And they came up with so many innovations that improved the cars and the motorcycles. As time went on, they got better and better. You didn't need the engineering degree to run it. It had a neutral. You know, it had an easier time starting it. It didn't have all that sequence. You had a throttle you could control instead of having to set the air mixture and the air mixture and the timing in order to control the speed. They got easier. So if you had a Lampson number 11, did you care about it after a while? Because it had been superseded by so many things so much better. So as much as we, with interest in history and all things mechanical and all things antique, would love to believe that these were cherished from the start to the finish of their existence, that's not real. That's just not real at all. At some point they were just, oh yeah, let's get rid of that, it's old. Bruce, I see you have a question.
Yeah, well, I was just going to ask, when did people really start to get interested in, preserving the history of motorcycles?
Well, the club that I belong to, the Antique Motorcycle Club of America, it was actually started not far from here by a group of gentlemen in 1954. And they were doctors, lawyers, and a few blue-collar guys. And their whole idealism was, this is important to America. The conservation of motorcycles. There was already automobile collecting guys, and they were doing their thing with the automobiles, but there was no real faction in the part of motorcycling. So these fellas started the Antique Motorcycle Club of America in 1954. We're up to over 20,000 members now worldwide. I joined in 1981, and it's been downhill ever since.
Are you talking your personal finances have been downhill ever since when you have to restore one of
Like
these?
riding the bike downhill.
Yeah, really. You put that much money into it and you're never going to sell it. So, yes, sir.
Does your motorcycling interest, how big's your collection?
I'm down to 20 motorcycles.
I like down too.
And I had well over 200 early pre-1900 bicycles. I think I'm down to 60 pre-1900 bicycles now.
What years
Most of my motorcycle interest lies between 1930 and earlier American-made bikes. My biggest part of my collection is bikes from the state of Mass.
He's home. Yes, Mrs. Tinney.
Did you ever come up with any pictures with anybody using one of those? Because I would think it would be kind of unusual.
I haven't seen any.
I've done a lot of research, and done a lot of digging through the archives, through the AMCA, and talking to old-time collectors from the AMCA. And a lot of them never even heard of this till the article came out in the magazine about it. You know, there's so many photographs, who knows? There's guys that are not motorcycle collectors or automobile collectors, but they're photograph collectors, and they enjoy pictures of imagery of people on bicycles or motorcycles. Who knows? They may have one in their collection that's just sitting there. And that's why exposure is paramount. What I'm doing for you folks today is exposure. And every time I show the machine, it's more exposure. And if 1% of the crowd, well, today it was more than 1%. It was double, like over 100% just came forward today of information that was not there before. And it's gonna slowly unmask that history that we need for the fella that developed this bike, Ernest Lamson.
And we'll be getting copies of everything in Abington, so we're covered. We kind of have our foot in the door now as it is, so that's kind of a good thing. Excellent. Any other questions?
I am.
Yes.
I was just wondering, and it might be a stupid question, but
No such thing.
on the handlebar, that is indeed a bell, right?
Yes, it is. It's a wind-up bell, where most bells that you see on bicycles, you pull the thumb lever.
Yeah.
This one has a push button. And then you
Twist the top to
It
rewind
was atypical for motorized vehicles. So motorcycles and early tiller-steered automobiles would have this type of bell because you don't want to even remove your thumb from the handle grip. This way here, you nick it with the side of your thumb to actuate it.
Now,
Because it's a pretty scary ride.
now there's also a case mounted on the handlebars with a pocket watch
Exactly.
on it. Now that's for more than just telling the time.
Right. The fuel consumption is a big deal. So even traveling from Abington here to Brockton, which is how many miles?
They're next door, so
25 miles?
not even. No.
Okay. Well,
Probably,
even
probably
that,
2 or 3.
Even that, say he had half a tank in here. So he would guesstimate 75 miles to the tank of fuel, and he's got half a tank. So then he would time his speed and the fuel to see if he can make it to that general store in the next town. Because you didn't go to a gas station. There was no gas bars. It was general stores, hardware stores, places of like that nature that contributed to the fuel. And you would buy a pail of fuel.
And hopefully have some sort of funnel or something to
They
fill the
didn't
tank.
care. They would have slopped it around.
All over the place. Okay.
Just like I was saying to you, there was no bike stand with this. They would lean it against a tree or throw it on the ground.
After spending $150 for it, come on.
Well, they
That
were
doesn't seem
wealthy.
fair.
They were
Apparently,
wealthy. They weren't
They could afford to
discriminating.
throw it around.
They just go buy another one.
You mentioned the brake system. Would you tell us more about the brake system?
Yeah, it's a typical bicycle coaster brake.
It's your back pedal,
You back pedal.
and it locks up the rear wheel.
Yeah,
It's really
just like a bicycle. But this one here is a little heavier duty than a regular bicycle, so the brake plates inside are a little more substantial than a regular riding bicycle. And by 1902, they actually expanded the brake drum more so they could put a larger size brake plates inside to contribute to their, because they're getting higher rates of speed. That by 1903, some bikes were getting up to 60 miles an hour.
like this.
Well, the whole configuration of the bikes
Was changing.
changed in
Yeah.
a matter of a year.
Yeah, I would think they'd have to.
Indian Motorcycle did that.
Okay. In Massachusetts. Perfect. Other questions? Yes, John.
I'm assuming that's a primitive muffler hanging on the bottom of that.
That's his design.
How loud would that engine have
Loud.
been? Loud. So you wouldn't need the bell to let people know you're coming.
Well, when you cut the engine coming into town, so you could slow down. Remember, you're
You're still
coasting
moving.
So you're coming into town at 35 miles an hour, let's say, and you cut the engine, you're still coasting at a good rate of speed. You're not going to just tromp down on that brake, or you're going to go butt over tea kettle.
Now, you mentioned, I'm sorry, the muffler was his fabrication?
It's his design, but it's quite period to all, like most bike builders.
Would have had something like it.
Ernest Thomas used the same type of muffler. They copied each other. They all took qualities from each other and did that.
And this also required special clothing in
Yes.
order to run it, so
You would have
did-
wore putties, like a horse riding putty, a leather gauntlet on your leg, so that you wouldn't burn yourself or nick yourself, or going at that rate of speed, tree branches.
Oh, good point. Yeah, absolutely.
And the advantage, think about it, 35 miles an hour for 75 miles. Your horse couldn't do that. Your horse could gallop from here, high speed, to the end of the entranceway, and he'd have to stop for a breather. And then you'd have to baby him for the next mile.
You wouldn't catch on fire though.
Yeah, but you had to cook.
One would hope.
But you had to cook dinner.
One way or another. Bruce?
I just wanted to ask a couple of technical questions about the motor. Was it a valve and head motor? What was the displacement? What type of carburation did it?
Well, this is a 1.5 horsepower engine. It runs on a Pocomi mixing carburetor.
I just
It's
slacked over.
atmospheric intake valves, mechanical exhaust valve.
What was the displacement? Induced displacement?
I mean CCs?
Yes.
Whatever a horse and a half produces.
Well, I mean, you could have a large engine that doesn't produce a lot of horsepower.
Well, like I said, its rate of speed would get up to 35 to 40 miles per hour. So CC-wise, that size there, I'd be saying you're running about maybe 75 to 110, somewhere around there in today's calculation.
Because the motors of those days were quite large in displacement compared to what they have today.
Well, Indian for 1901, when they came out, their displacement was around 250 cc, and they were doing 60 miles an hour. I have a 1906 Indian, and by 1906 they were able to get up to 95 miles an hour.
And does that one run?
It will be.
It will be, okay. This one
I
won't.
just found
That
the
will be.
carburetor for it last weekend in Philadelphia.
Nice. Again, pieces come from everywhere.
What was the ignition? Electrical, what kind of ignition did it have?
This had a dry cell ignition. There's 4 dry cell batteries in the square box at the back. The brass switch ahead of the box is your ignition switch. The round thing on top of the oil tank is your coil. That's a New York coil.
So it was like a primitive type of rotor type thing, or just, was there any kind of rotor, ignition rotor at all? Or?
No, nothing like that. There is no you've got a timer here. Here's your timer. So your points are, just got a static shock. The points are in here. So this is your advance and retard right here. So that would advance your timing or retard your timing, which increases or decreases your speed. That idealism left around 1907 because carburation had, this is all evolutionary, right? Even this carburetor, before this carburetor, as early as 1899, they were using a wick carburetor. And what the wick carburetor was, it was like a string that went through a tube underneath the gas tank and would be saturated with the gas and would protrude into the cylinder. They blew up. That's like lighting
No
a
surprise.
stick of dynamite.
Kind of like your acetylene light there. We have time for a few more questions. David?
The batteries, so there's no way of recharging them, so.
Total loss.
It was a lost battery. So how long would a battery last is a normal?
Typical ignition period on those batteries, I think you could likely get a week.
And then you.
Unless you left the switch on.
Yeah, then you didn't get a week.
You would go to the same hardware store you got your gasoline from, because it was the exact same batteries they used in the crank phones.
They chose something that was easily replaceable because they needed to. It was the AA of the time.
But it wasn't called Duracell.
Or Everready or anything else, apparently, at the time. One or two more, if we have any other questions. Yes, Ken?
The weight of that machine?
Well, I pick it up,
whole
and the whole thing, I would say $1.25, 125.
Is that kilograms or pounds?
Pounds. I'm a pound. I was raised in pounds, that's all I know.
Canadians, we never know.
I have a hard time buying meat at the store.
And any last question? Okay, good. What a great range of questions, from very technical to where my eyes were glazing over, to a little more practical at the same time on, does it catch fire? Yes, it catches fire. Anyway, Rick will be available for more questions, and we're going to stay in touch with the family because we have a lot more questions for them as we want to learn more about the man who created this bicycle, and motorbike, what's the correct term?
You could call it whatever you want.
Okay, but I mean...
But it's actually a motorized bicycle.
Motorized bike, okay, fine. Motorbike seems to fit.
Well, it kind of evolved by 1906. The technical term actually turned to motorcycle. Okay. And prior to that, it was motorbike. Because it was more bike-like.
Yeah, I mean, it looks like
it was more bicycle-like. But by 1906, the bicycle genre completely dropped because it didn't fit.
Right.
Because they had to redesign the frame to suit the conditions of the rider. Plus, riders are getting heavier.
Shame on them.
And bigger people,
Absolutely.
You know.
And also to adapt to the road conditions. I'm
and
sure
the road
too.
conditions
they can stand
were the
up to
biggest
more.
part. But like I was talking to you earlier about Better Roads movement, Better Roads movement came in around 1880s with the bicycle clubs in the area, and they were really striving to push for better roads, better equipped roads for traveling on, to get away from the wagon trails and that, to make a better commute for affluent people with money. They're the contributors to the tax infrastructure. So they said, we're putting the tax money into this place. We want better roads to commute on. So it made it more accessible for them.
For everyone.
For everybody.
Everyone
with
at
their
that
vehicles.
point, yes. Instead of just horse-drawn carriages.
Which led to the organization in Canada of the CAA, and down here it's AAA.
Yes.
And those organizations came about from the Better Roads movement.
Excellent. We still benefit today. That's a good thing. Clay, one more. Yes.
It's not a question. I just want to thank you for an excellent presentation.
Yes.
I mean, it was
We've all learned a lot today.
I cannot thank Doug enough.
Oh, please.
Not just his hospitality, but for accepting me to come down here, and I get all emotional about it.
That's all right. You're allowed.
Mostly because of these folks here and what it represents.
Yeah, absolutely. After all that work. So a few things. I'm going to release you in a moment to the cafeteria next door, which will give you more time to socialize with each other and enjoy some light refreshments after the program. Something I like to always do, how many Historical Society members do we have in the audience today? Look around to those who aren't raising their hands, please, and make them feel welcome. We'd like them to join. Anyway, so that's great. I have membership forms over here on the table. Membership in the society is $12 a year, or $75 for an annual membership. You get on our mailing list from doing that. We don't offer a lot beyond that, except you know about our programs, and you support the society. It's really our only source of income. We're all volunteers, and that's kind of what we do right now. So we rely on the charity of our members in order to survive and continue to put on programs like this. Also, I know Rick likes to talk about this machine quite a bit, and he's quite the expert on it, and there might be questions you haven't asked. Do I have permission to invite people forward to see it as long as they don't touch it?
Exactly.
Don't touch it. Okay, please.
It bites.
But anyway,
And so do I.
I thank you all for being here. I'll be meeting with the society within the month to start planning our programs for next year. And we want to hear from all of you. What sort of things do you want to hear? What sort of things interest you about history, particularly local history, but not necessarily. But what sort of things do you want to have programs about? We do 6 a year, and we want to do stuff that make you want to show up and participate and be here and join us. So your input is very much welcome and very much appreciated so that we can continue to do programs. We've had Bill taping us today, and we'll be on local cable and we will be on YouTube. So if there's something you missed, or if you want to recommend to other people that they get a chance to see this program today, we'll be publishing the link to it on the Historical Society of Old Abington's Facebook page, or you can just reach out and contact us. But it's another way to see what we do and keep it for future reference. And certainly, I know you have a lot of people you're going to share the link with. So
oh, yes.
It's a good thing. Anyway, so you've been an excellent audience. You've had wonderful questions. I thank you for finding us here today. A new location for us. We may use it again in the future. The town has been very generous to offer it to us. If you didn't get the memo, there is a shopping cart out in the back hall. We are accepting, they asked us if we would accept donations for the local food pantry. So if you don't have anything today but want to drop something off, you can do so for the food pantry. They're always appreciative of any charity in their direction. So once again, thank you all, and let's go eat. And thank you.
Thank you, Doug. Yeah, it was fun.
Did it feel good?
Oh, yeah.
Dick Patton.